things have only gotten worse in the Middle East, as you and I were warning they would. And the folks with the dead eyes have been making the case for new war, new genocide, new killing of civilians, just in a different part of the Arab world. This time Lebanon. We're speaking this week after a horrific massacre on Monday. 550 people killed, at least. We don't know how many are still under the rubble. In Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, we're talking about 50 kids killed, over 90 women killed. It's insane. I was reading the New York Times. It may be the single day record for number of people killed for many years in a conflict.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're not just going to connect the dots, we're going to draw the whole map. We're going to dive into a one-part of a gripping two-part series about a crisis too horrifying to ignore. As Gaza smolders under the weight of brutality, Lebanon now finds itself under siege. Are we witnessing a war or a genocide? Spoiler alert, the dictionary might need a new, stronger word. Mehdi Hassan and Owen Jones are here to dissect the hypocrisy, the atrocities, and the eerie silence of the so-called global moral police. Buckle up, because this isn't just news, it's history in the making. And yes, it might get a little dark, so we're bringing facts, a touch of humor, and maybe a few mic drops along the way. Let's dive in.
And yet very little outrage here in London where we are, or in DC where I normally am. It's just normalised.
Well, one of the deadliest days in the history of Lebanon, and Lebanon has a hideous history of brutality, including, of course, brutality by the Israeli state. I mean, the UN Secretary General, he's saying this could be another Gaza. I mean, you know, when we're at that point, you know, what we're talking about here is the normalisation of the mass slaughter of Arabs. The world is being told in no uncertain terms by Western governments and much of the Western media that Arab life means absolutely nothing. I mean, the fact hundreds of Lebanese civilians, and this is, I think, just to show this kind of normalisation, it's worth thinking back to when Israel invaded Lebanon back in 1982, and US Republican President Ronald Reagan got on the phone to the then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and said, this is a Holocaust. You have to stop this.
Yep.
Now, the US Democratic President Joe Biden, I presume, is not on the phone to his Israeli counterpart, yelling down the phone to stop this Holocaust. And that was, you know, I mean, we've seen these terrible Israeli atrocities in Lebanon before, but the fact is, in Gaza, we've now had nearly a year, and we've had some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century live streamed to us every single day. And you would imagine now there's some sort of, well, whoa here, come on. This has to be contained. There isn't any of that.
It's the opposite, right? It's what if you're the Israelis, you're like, well, they didn't stop us for a year in Gaza. Why not do Lebanon? And Joe Biden is a feckless president who hasn't stopped us in Gaza. There was reporting a few months back, which was they go into Rafah, then he's going to be really mad. And they went into Rafah, and he wasn't. And then there was reporting that, well, if they escalate the war in the region, America's not going to support them on that. And now they're saying, oh, yeah, by the way, if you need extra weapons for your new war in Lebanon, if Iran is provoked into entering the war, if et cetera, we've got your back. And if you're the Israelis, it's kind of like, well, why wouldn't you?
No, exactly. I mean, they've been given carte blanche to do exactly what they want. I mean, it's striking as well. Some Israeli outriders, in fact, Israeli ministers are talking of, well, we've shown huge restraint. Even the BBC, which frankly its coverage has been often appalling, but they point out that 80% of the cross-border attacks between Lebanon and Israel have been perpetrated by Israel. And obviously, if we're looking at the death toll, I mean, you know, we're talking about 99% of those being killed. I mean,
just on Lebanese. Monday, I just want to put this into context, half as many people were killed as were killed on October the 7th, right? And these are civilians. Let's be clear. The health minister in Lebanon said these are almost all, if not all, civilians.
And he's not Hezbollah or anything.
He's not.
Like
they can't play the Hamas-controlled health ministry game in Lebanon. He's a neutral doctor, not affiliated with any particular party.
A technocrat. He's Sunni. He's not. You know.
But you know, nobody cares. I mean, this is a frustration, and I think, you know, I said this in New York at the debate I was at the weekend. You know, we have opened the gates of hell well beyond Gaza. We've basically said anywhere around the world, you can do this, you can get away with it. The regional implications, you and I and others have been warning since October 7th. If this turns into a regional war, it's a moral disaster, a legal disaster, a geopolitical disaster. And of course, for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, it's a domestic political disaster. Do you really think that they're going to win an election if this escalates even more and America's dragged into a war with Iran? Which is clearly what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu's buying time for Trump.
Let's take a breather here. Honestly, this whole situation feels like an episode of the world's worst hypocrisy. Israel claims self-defense, right? But let's be real. It's not defense when you turned Gaza into an open-air prison and now Lebanon into your next target. It's like setting your neighbor's house on fire and claiming you felt threatened by the curtains. Meanwhile, Joe Biden's red lines? Seriously? They're more like those chalk lines cops draw around victims, useless and only show up after the disaster. And speaking of the West, have you noticed how every time Israel escalates, Western leaders, especially AIPAC leaders, it's as if they start their favorite gym exercises? The hand curls, the gold medals all around for deep concerns, while the death toll climbs faster than each rep they're able to execute. But let's not pretend this is new. From 1982 until today, the same patterns repeat. Israel acts with impunity, the world shrugs, and Arab lives are treated as expendables. The only difference now, social media ensures we see every atrocity in real time. And trust me, history will not be kind to those who stay silent.
Netanyahu can't do any of this without knowing that he's got the US behind him come what may. He can only escalate this because he's got the world's only hegemon behind him. And
who he's about to screw over.
Well, that's exactly it. He's calling their bluff. He knows, he can see in Gaza he's got away with everything, that the red line that Joe Biden's, the red lines he set in the past are meaningless, that all Joe Biden will do occasionally is hand-wringing, which he knows is for a domestic political audience. He knows that isn't, for Netanyahu, actions matter, not words. And again, the other similarity is Israel is not being subtle about his intent. Yeah. From the very beginning in Gaza, and this is why we need to listen to them carefully, there was never, and Raz Sigal, the Israeli-American professor, said it's almost unprecedented in history for a state to be so open about their intent. They said from the beginning, we're going to raise Gaza to the face of the earth. We're going to impose collective punishment. They did that. This time, for example, the Israeli Minister of Education on television, he said, we are going to annihilate Lebanon. It will be wiped out.
There's no difference, he said, between the Lebanese people and Hezbollah. He
said exactly that. And Yoav Gallant last year, the Minister of Defense, who has a request for an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity from the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. He said last year that it will be the civilians of Lebanon who will pay the price. He said, we know what we've done in Gaza, we can do to Beirut. We've got to take them seriously because those blood-curdling threats were put into practice in Gaza.
Yeah, and the Minister for Diaspora Affairs, a super right-wing dude who loves to hang out with Marine Le Pen, he put a tweet out with weird maps showing the redrawing of borders going back 100 years of Syria and Lebanon. He said Lebanon's not a real country. He said the enemy Shia population should be driven from the border. We should have a buffer zone, which just basically means we're going to take your territory. Very grand geopolitical language. A buffer zone is a new word for just we're going to take your land.
Well, it's just ethnic cleansing. They're going to depopulate.
Occupation. Yeah. But funny when Medvedev and Putin say this about Ukraine, it's not a real country. We deserve a buffer zone. We need to annex this part of territory for security. The Western governments lose their minds. Western journalists rightly lose their minds. And just, as you say, I think it goes back to your original point. It's Arab life in an Arab country. It doesn't really matter.
Well, see, I mean, that contrast, this
is racism at the heart of this.
Well, exactly. And that's the fact that Ukraine's happening simultaneously provides...
Forever.
It's a control. I mean, in a laboratory control where... And the world can see this. The world has seen how the West has responded when it comes to the pronouncements by senior Russian figures, even just Russian TV channel shows where they speak in.
And there's a like for like with Israeli channel shows.
Social media, I spoke to what's his name? He's a courageous Israeli journalist. Why have I just forgotten? Gideon Levy, and he pointed out that actually it's worse, those Israeli television segments, and you'll get there on national television, including Israeli ministers. Talking about collective punishment, and that's what they've enacted here. And I just think the point about Arab life there is the West is going to reap a bitter harvest for generations to come because, in the age of social media where people can see these atrocities, they can see Israeli soldiers throwing the bodies of Palestinians off roofs like they're ISIS. Yeah. They see all this, what's happened to children, the slaughter, the wiping out of Gaza. They can see this now happening in Lebanon, and they see just hand-wringing at best from the West, in contrast to Ukraine. And that is going to radicalize people for generations.
American intelligence agencies are already saying this. You don't need to be an intelligence official to know this. It's obvious. Hosni Mubarak, the Egyptian dictator, who no one was a fan of, actually did say something very wise in 2003 when Bush and Blair were going to Iraq. He said, you're opening the gates of hell. You're going to create 1,000 bin Ladens. He was right about the Iraq war. Gaza has now become Iraq on steroids. So God help us all in the coming years. And by the way, should just plug, since you mentioned Israeli TV shows and how they speak about Palestinians, we did a documentary called Israel's Real Extremism, which
brilliant.
covers some of this and interviews some of those TV hosts. So I would urge you, those of you who have not seen it, to check it out on the Zeteo website. Owen, before we run out of time, we've got to switch tack and talk about what is happening here in the UK. It's been a couple of months. When we last met, Labour had just been elected. England was still in the World Cup. Lots has changed since
Those
then.
heady days.
In the European Championships, I should say. Sorry. It's been quite a busy couple of months for UK media and politics. Just to quickly start, Labour government did a good job on arms licences by restricting some licences.
Well, look, let's be clear. They suspended 8%, and the bar really is on the floor, isn't it?
the bar was zero. The previous
The bar
government
is
did
zero.
nothing.
And a really crucial point is Britain supplies crucial components for the F-35 jets, which are
didn't know
raining death and destruction on Gaza. They're all excluded from any of this. And by the way, when they did their 8% based on legal advice, so actually they're legally obliged to actually suspend arms sales to Israel, they basically just bent over backwards apologising for it, saying Israel's this great ally and all the rest of it. And that I think is a striking example of the political antennae of this government. Because if you look at the polling shows the vast majority of Britons want a total arms embargo. Over half of the British public want Netanyahu arrested for war crimes. The vast majority think Israel is committing war crimes.
Yeah.
And if you look now at where Labour's at generally, I mean, they won this landslide because of our electoral system. They didn't have any enthusiasm. They got 33.7% of the vote in the lowest turnout of British adults in the history of British democracy. And they've plummeted since. They're now, I mean, Keir Starmer is, according to one poll, less popular than Rishi Sunak, who is the defeated Conservative leader after a cataclysmic defeat for the Tories after the worst government in our history.
To put that in further context for those watching abroad, Sunak, of course, took over from Liz Truss, who was defeated by a lettuce.
By a lettuce.
Okay.
God bless the lettuce.
Before we wrap this up, and before the algorithm dusts this video into thin air, I just want to leave you with one thing. When leaders say never again, they're supposed to mean it. Yet here we are, watching history repeat itself in HD, with the same old excuses but deadlier consequences. Silent isn't just complicity, it's a betrayal of every value the global community claims to uphold. In the next part, we'll dive into the geopolitical fallout, how this isn't just about Gaza or Lebanon, but the Asian president of the world. So hit like, share this episode, and subscribe if you're ready to fight the truth. My name's Z from Zees Political Arrow, where the sharpest takes meets the harshest realities. Until next time, stay informed and stay fearless.